And the intro to the book was actually written by Dawson's father. So the intro of the book, Dawson is the guy that wrote the book. Coningsby Dawson is the guy that wrote the book. Well, his dad wrote the intro to the book. And he kind of kicks it off, and here's some of the highlights of that. He says, "I've already stated the conditions under which this Book of My Sons was produced. He was wounded in the end of June 1917 in the fierce struggle before Lens. He was at once removed to a base hospital and later to a military hospital in London. There was in grave danger of amputation of the right arm, but this was happily avoided. As soon as he could use his hand, he was commandeered by the Lord High Commissioner of Canada to write an important paper detailing the history of the Canadian forces in France and Flanders." And he goes on to talk about how they came up with the name of the book, and they go through a couple different titles, and they settle on this title, The Glory of the Trenches. Lastly, we decided on The Glory of the Trenches as the most expressive of his aim. He felt that a great deal too much had been said about the squalor, filth, discomfort, and suffering of the trenches. Now, clearly, that's stuff that I've talked about. And so this should tell you, that's what I'm talking about. This is a different take on World War I. Because he's saying, look, we've heard enough about the squalor, the filth, the discomfort. I'm going to talk about the glory of the trenches. He pointed out that a very popular war book, which we were reading, had 6 paragraphs in the first 60 pages which described in unpleasant detail the verminous condition of the men, as if this were the chief thing to be remarked concerning them. He held that it was a mistake for a writer to lay too much stress on the horrors of war. The effect was bad physiologically. It frightened the parents of soldiers. It was equally bad for the enlisted man himself, for it created a false impression in his mind. We all knew that war was horrible, but as a rule, the soldier thought little of his feature in this lot. The real soldier's thoughts were concerned with other things. He was engaged in spiritual acts. And this is what I'm talking about. This is a different cut. He was accomplishing spiritual purposes as truly as the martyr of faith and religion. He was moved by spiritual impulses, the evocation of duty, the loyal dependence of comradeship, the spirit of sacrifice, the complete surrender of the body to the will of the soul. This was the side of war which men needed most to recognize. They needed it not only because it was the true side, but because nothing else could kindle and sustain the enduring flame of heroism in men's hearts. So he's looking at this, it's called The Glory of the Trenches. In this, what happens in the trenches is like a religion, is like a spiritual thing, which another thing that drew me to this is because, I talk all the time about how there's the most beautiful things in war. I mean, there's the most horrible things, but there's also these beautiful things. And so I can see he's very focused on what those things are. While some erred in exhibiting nothing but the brutalities of war, others erred by sentimentalizing war. He admitted that it was perfectly possible to paint a portrait of a soldier with an aura of a saint, but it would not be a representative portrait. It would be eclectic, the result of selection and elimination. So he's saying, like, on the one hand, you get these books that paint this crazy, brutal side of war. The other side, you get them painting soldiers as saints. And neither one is true, which I will totally agree with. We do have a definite tendency to do that in literature, or people that write about war. They want to write about, they make everyone look like the best guy ever. None of us are. None of us are. We all have faults. Back to the book. The ordinary soldier is an intensely human creature with an endearing blend of faults and virtues. The romantic method of portraying him not only misrepresented him, but its result is far less impressive than a portrait painted in the firm lines of reality. So they do all this to make the guy look like a saint, but what's real is actually more amazing. There's an austere grandeur in the reality of what he is and does, which needs no fine gilding from the sentimentalist. To depict him as Sir Galahad in holy armor is a serious offense as to exhibit him as a Caliban, which is, it's from Shakespeare. It's from The Tempest. He's like the ultimate bad guy in the Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. It's a total beast. So you can't portray the person as Galahad. You can't, again, portray him as a saint. Each method fails of truth, and all that the soldier needs to be known about him, that men should honor him, is the truth. War, a hot new air which men breathed, produced new energies and forms of thought. Men were rediscovering themselves, their own forgotten nobilities, the latent nobilities in all men. Bound together in the daily obedience of self-surrender, urged by conditions of their task to regard duty as inexorable, confronted by the pitiless destruction of the body, they were forced into recognition of the spiritual values of life. So faced with what they were facing in World War I, and we've talked about that over and over again, you're facing death. And these guys, these soldiers, are forced to look at their spiritual self. In the common conventional use of the term, these men were not religious. There was much in their speech and in their conduct which would outrage the standards of narrow pietism. So, hey, these guys are not goody two-shoes. Traditional creeds and forms of faith had scant authority for them. But they had made their own a surer faith than lives in creeds. So what they discover on the battlefield is even stronger than what the churches say. It was expressed not in words but acts. They had freed their souls from the tyrannies of time and the fear of death. They had accomplished indeed that very emancipation of the soul, which is the essential doctrine of all religions, which all religions urge on men, but which few men really achieve, however earnestly they profess forms of pious faith. That's pretty amazing. It's a pretty amazing viewpoint. That what you find out on the battlefield is spiritually stronger than what you find in the church. Mm-hmm. Back to the book. This was the true glory of the trenches. They were the cavalries of a new redemption being wrought out for men by soiled, unconscious Christs. So that's what the soldiers were. Soiled, dirty, unconscious means they don't even know it. Christs. And as from that ancient cavalry, with its agony of shame, torture, and dereliction, there flowed a flood of light, which made a new dawn for the world. So from these obscure crucifixions, there would come to men a new revelation of the splendor of the human soul. The true divinity that dwells in man, the God made manifest in the flesh by acts of valor, heroism, and self-sacrifice which transcend the instincts and promptings of the flesh and bear witness to the indestructible life of the Spirit. That's heavy.
Yes.
That's just it. Like I said, this viewpoint is, I can totally understand where it's coming from, and it expresses a lot of the things that I think. I haven't thought about it to this degree, though. Mm. You know, basically it's calling the deaths of soldiers on the battlefield crucifixions.
Right.
And that God is made manifest in the flesh. That these guys, when they make these sacrifices, it's like a glimpse of God. These acts of valor and heroism. And it's just very powerful.